and may we fall more in love with you as a result. Amen. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Marcus. It's brilliant to be back and actually get my face mark off. I can itch my beard. So thanks for having me back online and in person here. As Marcus says, we're going to be looking at the letter to the Hebrews, what it can tell us about Jesus, and hopefully a bit about what it can tell us about ourselves. And although I'm going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 3 tonight, I thought it would be good, as it's the start of the series, to paint a bit of a bigger picture about the letter, give it a bit of context. A real suggestion for everyone is to consider reading the whole letter in one go, maybe this week, to set yourselves up for the oncoming series, because I think we all know it's very easy, isn't it, to sort of cherry-pick Bible verses and even cherry-pick chapters. And I think, as you'll find as we go through this, you'll see that there's a danger in cherry-picking chapter 3. So that's a kind of little mini challenge to you, as well as Marcus's challenge about the timestamp. Someone once said that if you love Jesus, you will love the letter to the Hebrews. If you love Jesus, you will love the letter to the Hebrews. But I think Hebrews is a little bit like Marmite. I think you either love it or you kind of find it very heavy going. There are, as we'll find out, so many references to Judaism, to the Hebrew folklore, the Hebrew heroes, Hebrew customs. I find that a bit daunting myself. So it's important to understand that the letter was probably written primarily to Jewish Christians, people who've been brought up in the Jewish faith and had they become Christians. And it was probably written to Jewish Christians, most likely in Rome, about AD 55 to 70. Okay, so Jesus died around about AD 30, a bit after AD 30. So it's a bit like saying, compared to today, it's as if Jesus had died and risen again in about 1995. And it's that kind of period of time sort of beyond that these people are receiving this letter. And most of them would have been raised as Jews, and then they would have then heard the message of Jesus and then made the decision to accept that Jesus was the Messiah and that the faith that they've been following all their lives was now a faith for everyone. But, there's a lot of evidence to show there remained thousands of Jews, particularly in Rome. There's probably about 50,000 Jews living in Rome, half the size of Colchester living in Rome, who were Jewish. Many, many Jews who didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. And so would have seen these Jewish Christians as heretics. And these Jewish Christians were increasingly coming under persecution. But not only persecution because Christianity was illegal, unlike Judaism, which wasn't illegal, they came under huge kind of cultural pressure to return to the Orthodox Jewish faith. So in a way, the letter, I think it's easy to read it, I think in a good sense, that it's encouraging them to really understand who Jesus is, to stick with him. And because it's them, it talks a lot about their Jewish faith and their Jewish hero figures. So it's speaking very much to their contexts. And I think what it's trying to do overall is to set out, or probably reassert, just who Jesus really is. Just who Jesus really is in relation to them. So perhaps the obvious question is for those of us that haven't been raised as Jewish people, myself, probably most of the people here, why should we really care about the letter? Should we just sort of park it off to one side? Well, I'm obviously going to say no. But I think there's two real key reasons. I think the first thing is that actually we all need to remind ourselves regularly just who Jesus really is and where he's sitting relative to everything else in our lives. That's the first reason. And the second reason is actually, just like these Jewish Christians, we all have times when we struggle in our faith and when we need to be brought back to Jesus. And in fact, our struggles in our faith, if you've experienced them, are often directly connected to the fact that we've stopped letting Jesus be who he really is, and we've actually settled for a lesser Jesus. And I think once we understand this, we can see the importance of trying to find ways in our lives of regularly almost recalibrating ourselves, just to make sure that Jesus is the number one priority, but also to encourage others to do the same. Okay, and that's actually what I think this letter is about. And as we'll see shortly, it's especially what Hebrews chapter 3 is about. Okay, so, but before I do that, I just want to talk a bit about movies. So look, many movies, particularly kind of thrillers and sci-fis, have a pattern. And the pattern is that at the start of the film, you don't really understand what's going on. There's lots of scenes and lots of characters. And the story builds, and you're still trying to figure it out as you go along. And eventually you get to a kind of aha moment, you know, like in The Matrix or something like that, or Fight Club, where you suddenly kind of go, now I'm looking back across the whole of the film and I see what it's all about. Do you know what I mean? So the letter to the Hebrews is exactly not like that, okay? It's exactly not like that. Do you know what? Actually, Hebrews has a massive spoiler at the start of the letter. So it's interesting we start in chapter 3 because the spoiler is in chapters 1 and 2. So I'm going to have to touch on that at some point. Because chapters 1 and 2 tell us really who Jesus is, really who he is. And then the rest of the letter kind of needs to be read in that context. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's read together the start of chapter 3. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it quite quickly because I know that you're all going to be reading this during the week when you read the whole of Hebrews, aren't you, Joe Karen? Okay, so I'm going to read the first 6 verses. Therefore, brothers and sisters, holy partners in a heavenly calling, consider that Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was also was faithful in all God's house. Yet Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses, just as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that will be spoken later. Christ, however, was faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house, if we hold firm to the confidence and the pride that belong to hope. So that's the first bit of Hebrews chapter 3. And of course we've touched on Moses there. One of the biggest heroes, perhaps the biggest hero of the Jewish faith. No, the biggest hero of the Jewish faith, I think. And if we read it quickly, what it seems to be saying is that Jesus is definitely a notch above Moses. I think you'd agree, yeah? He's a notch above Moses when it comes to being faithful to God, for example. You know, and Moses really was the granddaddy of the Jewish faith. So if you've been brought up as a Jew, you know, you're being reminded, hang on guys, he's above what you thought was the highest. So, you know, I just wonder, though, whether we're misreading it a little bit. Have you ever played Top Trumps? Does anyone know what Top Trumps is? Or Pokemon cards? I'm looking at Marcus now. Mark, you're probably a Pokemon person rather than Top Trumps. When I was a kid, so I had Top Trumps as a card game. I had one when I was a kid. It was German automobiles of the 1970s. It's really, really exciting, you know. What you have is you play against other people with your cards, and each card is a car, and the card has attributes like number of cylinders, weight, speed to 0 to 60, top speed, those kinds of things. And the object of the game is to call out that attribute which you hope is going to beat your opponent's cards, yeah? Well, you know, I think you can read Hebrews 3, and actually all of Hebrews, as if it was written a bit like the writer trying to play a game of top trumps with Jesus, yeah? And just reflecting myself, I wonder whether sometimes that's what I do with Jesus, that I actually see him as a bit like one of the top trump cards in my life. You know, he's one of many cards that I'm playing with, Sure, he's important, just like to an early Christian. Moses was still really important, the second best top trump card. Yeah, and I might have other cards that are important to me in my game of life. So good health might be a good card. Success, wealth, recognition might be things that I want to be playing and have in my hand, strengthen my hand against my opponents. I want to be happy with my looks. I want to have ears that don't stick out anymore. Well, working on that. Someone noticed. So I wonder, it's maybe worth us thinking, if you were being asked what are the top trump cards or the Pokemon cards in your life, what are they? They'll be different for each of us, the ones we most like to have if we were playing the game. So, Jesus here in chapter 3, he's got some pretty impressive attributes. According to verse 1 that I read out, he'd probably score highest as apostle and high priest, definitely beating Moses hands down. If you played Moses on either of those categories, well, he'd lose on high priest because Aaron was high priest anyway, so he'd just have a sort of 0 against it. But Jesus definitely wins, But it's not that we're denying that he's probably the best card we have in our life for most of us. If we were asked that question, what's the most important thing in our life? What the first half of chapter 3 is really saying is actually that Jesus is not quite a bit better than all the other things in our life, or all of the Jewish heroes, or should be. It's saying that Jesus is the life. He's not the best card. He's the game. That's what Hebrews 3 is saying. You see, think about verses 3 to 6 when it talks about Moses and about the house and Jesus being the builder of the house. Moses is a brick in the house that Jesus has been building. And I talked about a spoiler alert. If you're reading Hebrews in chapters 1 and 2, you get the end at the beginning. And that is that actually what chapters 1 and 2 says is Jesus wasn't the best of the Jewish prophets. This letter isn't reminding these people that Jesus is the best of the Jewish prophets. What it's telling them is that Jesus was and is God himself. That's what chapters 1 and 2 say, and that's why you need to read all of Hebrews rather than from 3 onwards, okay? The meaning of the world, the universe, and all of our lives, of all things, is wrapped up in Jesus. In chapter 1, the writer writes that Jesus is the heir of all things. All things. Jesus is through whom all things were created. All things were created through Jesus. And it says all things are sustained by Jesus. Everything is sustained by Jesus. This ain't no Pokemon card or top trump card. This is something quite cosmic and quite different. So I wonder, and I was wondering reading this and thinking this way, and maybe I hope God was speaking to me this way and challenging me this way. Have I made the mistake sometimes? Am I making a mistake a bit now even of treating Jesus like a top trump card? A bit like a brick, albeit an important one, but a brick in the house that I'm trying to build, yeah? Alongside the other priorities and the ambitions that I'm trying to construct for myself. And as I said, the truth is that Hebrews tells us is that Jesus is the game. He needs to be the builder of our house. And until we let him be the builder of our house, our lives will never be at rest. So let's read the second half from verse 7. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, as on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your ancestors put me to the test, though they had seen my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with that generation, and I said, they always go astray in their hearts, and they have not known my ways. as in my anger I swore, they will not enter my rest. Take care, brothers and sisters, that none of you may have an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, but exhort one another every day as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partners of Christ, if only we hold to our first confidence firm to the end. As it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Now, who were they who heard and yet were rebellious? Was it not all those who left Egypt under the leadership of Moses? But with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, those whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? If not, those who were disobedient. So we see that they were unable to enter the rest because of unbelief. I've read it quickly. You can read it again when you read the whole of the book of Hebrews this week. Okay? And there's a few repetitions there I hope you picked up, and even referring back to the first passage I said as well. So the second half of the chapter here is reminding the Jewish Hebrew Christians of some of the most famous, well, perhaps one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. The story of how the Jewish people, set free from slavery in Egypt, ended up spending 40 years in the wilderness before they entered the rest of the Promised Land, when it should have taken them 5 days. Should have taken them 5 days. If you're Andy Courtier anyway, on walking, it would have taken 5 days. Yeah? And in fact, verses 7 to 11 are actually an extract from Psalm 95. So it may have even been sung when they read this bit out. And it may have been a song that they were really familiar with, like, Build My Life. If you're, usually Joe Caron, if he's doing a worship set, I'm amazed tonight that we didn't have Build My Life, It's still got one more to come, folks. Wait for it. So it would have spoken to them immediately, this psalm. It would have been a very familiar song to them. And it's very clear from that Old Testament story, they would have known that the reason the Jewish people wandered in the desert, and that all of them would die out, bar Caleb and Joshua, was because they'd hardened their hearts against God. They'd stopped praising God for their deliverance. They'd started moaning. And they'd even started worshipping false gods. And they'd stopped trusting God for their provision. Now, we all know this. We all know this. It's a familiar story even to us. So, but the point is that the writer to the Jewish Christians is actually pointing out to them that the real danger is they're falling into the same trap. So there's a danger that we can read this and say, oh yeah, we know that story. We know that story. But actually, there's a danger we can fall into exactly the same trap, and that's why it's worth reading. Because these Jewish Christians are finding themselves at a time of persecution and struggle, and they're feeling tempted to go back to their old ways. And when we struggle in our faith, very often, in tandem, our hearts harden. When we struggle in our faith, our hearts harden. I'm not even sure which comes first, but they're pretty much intertwined in my experience. And actually, I found this out again, to my annoyance, during the month of August this year. I got very dry in my faith. I felt a bit burnt out, to be honest, by the sort of previous few months and stuff. Very dry in my faith. Fellow Christians annoyed me. Same with my work colleagues. Got on my wick. Patterns of worship were a little bit irritating. I felt they could be improved on, if only they'd listen to me. My Bible readings were as tokenistic as they possibly can be. Let's get them out of the way. Let's tick the box. Sometimes I found myself muttering when I was reading the Bible, well, they would write that, wouldn't they? I learned that studying a history degree, by the way, to be sort of skeptical and cynical, but that's kind of how it was going, if I'm honest. And I was leaning away from God. I was probably a bit depressed too, and I certainly wasn't at peace. I wasn't entering the rest that we've been talking about here. And I would say, over my many decades as a Christian, I've experienced many periods where my heart has hardened this way. When I've lost my love for others and actually lost my love for God. When I've become rebellious, untrusting, and a bit ungrateful. My goodness, I wish it didn't happen so often, and sometimes it happens for a long time. But there's two things I've noticed that usually get me beyond that state of being and have got me back to a softer heart and a heart that's leaning towards God. And both of these things I find in the second part of chapter 3 of Hebrews. And the first of those things is the encouragement from others and attention shown to me by other Christians. Now, towards the end of August, out of the blue, I had a text from someone in the church I wasn't expecting. And what it said was, he was praying that God would meet me at my point of need and satisfy my heart's desires. That's all the text said. Came out of the blue, in the middle of my cynicism and kind of feeling low. But somehow, it just created a kind of release for me, and it was almost a permission to go back to God and say, God, the desire of my heart is to be rid of where I am. Can you, God, get rid of this hardened heart again? Can you soften my heart again? Take away the cynicism and restore that sense of love. So, think about who you're encouraging in the faith around you. Do it a bit more. Because we're not called to a personal faith. Christian faith is not a personal faith. It's not a lonely, introspective battle. We're called by God to a communal faith and to be part of a body, full of celebration, full of supporting each other and nudging each other back onto the right path. Not out on a limb, encouraging each other's really matters, and it works. So that's the first thing we actually see in the second part of chapter 3. It talks about that. And the second antidote to hardness is also in verse 14, and it's earlier in the text as well, which is these words, we hold our first confidence firm to the end. We need to hold our first confidence firm to the end. Well, what does that mean? What is our first confidence? What is our first confidence? Well, you could think of a lot of things that's our first confidence, and that the Jewish Christians might be thinking is their first confidence. It might be confidence that Jesus is the Messiah. It might be that confidence that he is God, or it might be the confidence that our eternity is with him, that my sins are forgiven, and it's sort of all those things to some extent. But I think most importantly, our first confidence as followers of Christ is confidence that he loves us. That's the first thing he did for us. The first thing God does for us and all creation is he loves it and he loves us. And you can't cure a hard heart without love. It's impossible. It's impossible. So, I'm wrapping up now, but if there's anyone here tonight who is struggling a little bit in their faith or online, if you're feeling a bit dry and a bit cynical, a bit burnt out and going through the motions, really the only way you will move out of that is reconnecting yourself back to your first confidence, which is his love for you, which always came before your love for him. So, unfortunately, it's incredibly simple, folks. And it's the same message that we maybe heard many times, but it's the most important message, because everything we do, everything we feel flows out of receiving the love of God and being able to love him back and be back in love with him. And when we do that, it's only through that that we can love others properly. How do we do this? How do we love people? How do we soften our hearts? How do we get back to God and fall in love with him? Well, do you know, that's another whole sermon. I don't have time for that. But can I suggest a starting point? I was reading a poem by the US poet called Mary Oliver, who some of you might know. Do you know her, Marcus? No, okay. He's an English teacher, I thought, if anyone's going to know her. I'm not even sure she's a Christian, but listen to these words. She wrote in a poem, "Let me keep my mind on what matters, which is my work, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished. Let me keep my mind on what matters, which is my work, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished." Because when our hearts harden, one of the first things we lose is a sense of astonishment. We've seen it all before. About anything. So spend your time this week re-astonishing yourself with who Jesus is. Find some time not to be busy. Recalibrate your perception of Jesus in light of Hebrews 3, Hebrews 2, and Hebrews 1. Because if you read those chapters backwards, you'll find that he's the builder of our lives, but he's also the originator and the purpose of creation. Hand over your top trump cards. I'm looking at Marcus here. I don't know why. I need to hand over my top trump cards to him. Let him speak to you, whether in the quiet of a room or in the world around you. Oh man. I'm going to ask the band to come up, but I want to just pray a prayer from the letter to the Ephesians, just over all of us really, which is from Ephesians chapter 3, verses 16 to 21. Many of you will be familiar with it, but I think it's just a great word for tonight. Let's see if I can find it first. Okay. It goes like this. I pray that, according to the riches of his glory, he may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. And now, to him who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen.